Okay, this video was a viewer request from Gwynplaine, asking you shall receive, and today's video is about the Ethiopian Army from 1887 to 1896, and this is going to cover their initial clashes with the Italians in 1887, their clashes with the Mahdists from 1890 to 1894, and the campaign that ultimately ends with the Battle of Adwa from 1895 to 1896. Now, the character of the Ethiopian army is kind of interesting. It's not what you'd expect out of a lot of tribal armies, though it is very much a tribal army. It's very medieval, and so that's something I found interesting. The Ethiopian army at this time it's a tribal army. It's made up of various tribes of people. It's not a professional army in a sense that we would be used to with like a European standing army, but it's also not a disorganized mob. Basically, it was what you might think of as like a medieval army. The king of Ethiopia, the emperor of Ethiopia, had a number of lords and chieftains that were loyal to him. And so they're really the permanent troops, which he did have some, were mostly like the emperor's retainers or his personal guard. Really, the bulk of the troops were these tribal warriors from the outlying regions, and those were men that answered to his nobles, to his aristocrats or chieftains loyal to him. And they weren't really bound to go to war. Everybody kind of went to war because war meant an opportunity for some loot, for personal glory, and largely they would also look at it as common defense. They were coming together to fight an enemy, be it especially like the Muslims in Sudan, the Mahdists. They were coming together to fight these guys to defend their lands, but they weren't necessarily commanded by their chieftains. They're in many ways they're like American Indian. A lot of the American Indian tribes, the chief couldn't really tell him what to do. He was just sort of an influential guy that led them, and they would choose to follow that man. The warriors themselves would have all been armed with swords, shields, and spears. The sword was the shotel type sword, and this type of curved sword would have really been universal in Ethiopia. A large part of the men also had firearms, and those firearms could range from older muzzle-loading, matchlock, flintlock, and percussion arms, all the way straight through in large numbers, really, to modern arms that fired metallic cartridges, mostly single shot guns, but sometimes you would find repeaters. The modern arms you would see would have been everything from Graz, Chassepos, Mauser 1871s, Berdan 1 and 2s, Vetterlis. They actually bought Vetterlis from the Italians before the war, before hostilities. A lot of Remington rolling blocks, the occasional Martini Henry, Winchester 1866s. That weapon has been getting mentioned a lot lately. It did get around. And you would still see some older flintlocks and percussion guns and things like that. And that they would have been more prevalent from 1887 really to early 1895. You're going to see a lot of the older muzzle loaders. Toward the end of 1895, a large proportion of those men are going to have modern metallic rifles, breech loading rifles, and some of those rifles like Kropatschek 1878s and Vetterlis with the magazines, they're going to be repeaters. If a man had means, he would also get himself a horse, and horses, cavalry were a very, very important part of the Ethiopian army at this time. Now, when they went to go mobilize this army, it was really done by word of mouth. They would send out men to spread the message. They would also beat signal drums, and the men would come, and they were usually pretty motivated to fight, somewhat by plunder, other times by common defense. Historically, they were threatened by the Muslim tribes in the Sudan, and so they'd come together to fight them. And some of the men had a personal loyalty, especially the retainers of a chieftain or an aristocrat. The emperor, all his retainers were there at a loyalty. And other than the king's personal guard, it was really a temporary army. They didn't have much of a logistics system. And one of the things that Menelik did, the Emperor Menelik, is when he was collecting taxes and things like that, he would have his people go out and do geography surveys to see what the land was like. And that would give him a good idea of places to fight in the country, which terrain would be favorable to him. Because his army wasn't really a professional army, it was a tribal army. And so they didn't have like a professional artillery corps, professional engineers, or anything like that. The army also didn't really have logistics, and so it was a highly mobile army. They basically lived off the land as they moved, and if that meant they couldn't stay in any one place for very long, or they'd use up all the firewood and they'd eat all the food, and then they'd use up all the fodder for the animals. And so the Ethiopian army was not an army that was set up to do things like sieges. They couldn't do it. If they fought a battle, they kind of had to plan where they were going to be and where they were going to strike. They did eventually, and occasionally set up some kind of food caches ahead of time where they could march an army to and then forage in the area and then maybe have an extra day's worth of food. But that wasn't really how the army functioned. It was temporary, highly mobile, and could disperse very quickly. They also had a problem with ammunition supply. Though they did try to rectify it, they tried to buy as much new ammunition as they could. The people did tend to hoard the ammunition. They didn't want to waste it because they didn't know it was going to be available again. And so that's a problem with the Army. The ammunition issues will also lead in a big part to lack of firearms proficiency. They really couldn't train. And that carries on especially to the artillery. The Ethiopians did have a lot of artillery pieces of really any kind of make and model, at various calibers. Some of the guns they would have been Egyptian, probably Egyptian Krupp mountain guns. They also had some Hotchkiss revolving guns, 37 millimeter revolving cannons. But they didn't have ammunition to train with them. They didn't have the support equipment that those guns were required, like the caissons and the ammunition wagons and the field forges. And so it wasn't very mobile artillery. Once it was in place, that's pretty much where it was staying. And it was more effective in the static positions, like a siege, which, as I talked about just now, the Ethiopian Army wasn't very good at. And so the artillery, they had it, it existed, but it wasn't really their most effective arm. Their effective arm was their cavalry and their irregular infantry. And the tactics they used to fight were not dissimilar to what you'd see with the Zulu, who have the horns of the buffalo, while the Ethiopians had a crescent. It's had a crescent-shaped attack where you'd have the main body come in, and the ends of the crescent would try to envelop and flank the enemy. The Ethiopian army also very much they used terrain to their advantage. They weren't out a stand-up European army, and they knew that. And so they would fight in places where they had a lot of natural cover, and they would use the mountains and the gullies to their advantage. If you look at a place like Ottawa, it's described as being a valley, and it is a valley, but within that valley are a lot of hills and gullies and wadis and things like that where the troops can move. They can screen their movements because, even though they were largely pretty well armed, they weren't very well trained, and they were not very good with their rifles. And they did know that. They knew they had an ammunition issue. And so the soldiers did tend to hold their fire until they were very close, where they had a higher hit probability. Now, they weren't very good shots, but they did have the forethought to try to maximize their hit probability within their limits. And so that's something that they were actually pretty good at. But they did like to close with the enemy. That's where they could really do a lot of damage, when they would close. And this illustration here comes out of a period French magazine where it actually does a pretty accurate job of showing the Ethiopian army on the move. It was a very large, irregular army. And they were basically a horde. They were almost like a migration of people moving. And this is the Ottawa battlefield. So you can see, yeah, it's a valley, but it's got a lot of hills and it's very, very rough terrain. And this is what it would have looked like during the battle. The Ethiopians were very, very good at using the terrain to their advantage. And they knew there was an army that worked well within their limitations. They understood what they could and couldn't do. And they would often lead the attack with the cavalry. They wanted to get into the enemy's firing lines as quickly as possible, and they wanted to negate their firepower advantage. And then the infantry could follow on and try to reinforce the cavalry. And really with their hand weapons, which they were actually very good at fighting with, they would just try to overwhelm them and try to break them. If we look at a battle map of Ottawa, this is what we're dealing with. You can see all these hills where they were able to maneuver their troops in and out. Now, getting really to the armament of the Ethiopian army, I want to come back to this with some hard numbers. In January 13th, 1895, the Battle of Kotet, Menelik had roughly 12,000 men with guns. One half to one third of those guns were muzzle loaders. He had an additional 7,000 men with swords and spears. By September of 1895, the proportion of men, both with muzzle loaders and swords with spears, would go down dramatically. He got in a lot of weapons. And I'm reading this directly from a source for the Battle of Ottawa, March 1st, 1896, for the Ethiopian Army. Nagasti Menelik, the Emperor Menelik, had 25,000 rifles, 3,000 horses, and 32 guns. One of the men below him, Taitu, had 3,000 rifles, 600 horses, 4 guns. Aymanat had 5,000 rifles. Makonnen, 15,000 rifles. Ras Ala, 12,000 rifles, 6 guns. Aktachim, 6,000 rifles. Ras Makael, 6,000 rifles, 5,000 horses. Ras Oli, 8,000 rifles, for a total of 8,000 rifles, 8,600 horses, and 42 guns. It was an incredibly well-equipped army with a lot of cavalry and even a lot of cannons, though the cannons themselves were not too effective. Once they were in place, they weren't really moving around. They couldn't practice with the cannons very much, so they weren't very accurate. But overall, the character of this army is an army that it's a tribal army, and so they do have men with spears and shields, but they also have a lot of men with modern rifles and cavalry, a lot more cavalry and artillery than you're going to see really in any African tribal army. It's kind of unprecedented. They were incredibly well armed. It's a limited army. The troops aren't really the best, but the emperor, their commanders know their limitations, and they use the men well within their limitations. They use the terrain of their country very well. They understand the geography. And so if I were going to use these men in a game of the men who would be kings, the army is really going to consist of irregular infantry and cavalry, tribal infantry and cavalry, and poorly drilled mountain guns. One aspect of the troops that I did read and I did notice was that the soldiers, the men on foot, fought in very loose order, and they didn't really listen to commands. Each guy, when he would go into action, would retreat when he felt like retreating, when he felt like that was in his best interest. He would advance when he wanted to. They would do it as a group, but then men would break off and kind of do what they felt was best for them. And so in that sense, I might rate them as unwilling, not necessarily to say that they didn't want to fight, but they didn't necessarily fight as a cohesive group like you'd expect regulars to all do something at once. They did what they wanted to do once they got there. For certain groups, like the bodyguard of a chieftain or the bodyguard of the emperor, well, they're going to follow orders. They're sworn, kind of, they're the retainers to a certain noble. And so for those guys, it's a little bit different. They did have some very modern rifles, like some Lebel 1886s and a smokeless powder gun, but they didn't really seem to use those weapons any differently than they would have used their black powder single shot rifles. They tended to wait to get very close before they fired their rifles. They weren't very good shots, and so I would probably rate them all as poor shots, but poor shots with modern rifles. The cavalry did seem to be incredibly brave, so I might rate them as fierce because they just kind of went right in. They would charge right into the lines of firing men, trying to close the distance so the infantry could follow on. But overall, an Ethiopian army would be challenging, I think, to play if you're trying to play them accurately to the way they fought, because you're going to really have to close the distance, and you're going to rely greatly on terrain. And if you're setting up just a regular game board and it's not your game board and you couldn't plan where you're going to fight, there may not be a lot of cover for you. But it would be an interesting army to play. If you could play it well, it'd be an incredibly effective army, I think. But it's an army where numbers and terrain are key. But they do have it's somewhat unusual for a tribal army. They have artillery and they have modern rifles and lots of cavalry, and so that's something I found very interesting. This maybe wasn't my best video. There just wasn't really a lot to say about the Ethiopian army. I mean, they're more or less the same when they fight the British in 1867. They have less modern rifles, and they're pretty much the same when they fight the Italians in 1936. The Ethiopian army did not need to change a lot. And so that's something I also found interesting. But if you like this one, yeah, please leave a comment below and check out a lot of my other videos. I feel like the Mexican army one I did before this was a bit better. I don't know. I mean, maybe I like the Mexicans more too, so I felt better about the video. But thank you for watching, and goodbye.